Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on evaluating ideas, navigating an uncertain world with critical thinking. These are actually part of our series of webinars on creativity and critical thinking. We had one last month on creativity, on the International Day of Innovation and Creativity. And we just saw that critical thinking doesn't have its international day, so let's try to also make every day the day of critical thinking. And so for that, we have invited a great panel made of Jonathan Osborne, a professor at Stanford University, and who is really one of the experts on science education, and also the chair of the science expert group of PISA, Elena Pasquinelli, at the Fondation La Main à la Pâte, or the hands-on science, and also a member of the Scientific Council of the Ministry of Education in France. Mikiko Nishimura, the professor at International Christian University in Japan, and last but not least, Caroline Dominguez, professor of management at the University of Trás-os-Montes, and Alto Douro, UTAD, in Portugal. And so all of them have actually worked a lot on critical thinking. Some of them are part of the project that we have at the OECD on that. And perhaps I will start by saying a few words about that project. It's a project by the OECD Center for Education, Research and Innovation. And we've been working for the past almost 8 years, both in school and in higher education, on how to foster critical thinking in education. So how to make it visible to students, to teachers. And we have developed different types of resources actually to support the development of these very important skills. We've been working on that for several reasons. One, because it's so important, in our democracies to actually nurture the critical thinking of people. Second, because, in the world where innovation is so important, we know that this is one of the key skills along creativity, complex problem solving, and a few others, and one that is in very high demand in the labor market. And so that's really, and of course now, with the generative AI and all the recent discussions we've had, this has also become something that has really been brought to the fore. So big question for us is, what are we really talking about? Why it is important? How does it relate to science, for example, and scientific thinking? And how can we actually make this agenda much more vibrant? So we have a great group of panelists, and I shall say that Jonathan and Elena, work a lot on science education and done a lot of work on school education. Caroline and Mikiko, have been working a lot on that in higher education. And so what we would like to do today is also to bring these two different levels of education. The reason why we have at the OECD worked both in school and higher education is really because we believe of the importance of having an alignment, so make sure that the students are prepared for critical thinking when they arrive in higher education, and that this journey continues while they are there. And rather than having disaligned incentives for all of these different things. So let me start, and perhaps let's start with discussing a bit why it's so important to actually develop critical thinking in education and in higher education, and also how actually this relates to learning more generally speaking. So let me start with Elena. You've been working on hands-on science education for a while, and you've been actually the coordinator of work on critical thinking in France for the Scientific Council of Education at the French Ministry of Education. So why was it so important in France to have work on that, and how do you link this to science education?
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor. So we've started to work on critical thinking, luckily, in France quite a long ago, and before many things happened in France, which made it even more relevant. As you know, we've had problems with radical positions, criticisms towards science in a very hard way, doubts about vaccination, and now a huge preoccupation with what is called fake news, which becomes also preoccupation with AI. But we started long ago. And when we started to work on critical thinking, it was really connected to science education. Basic idea is that any citizen has to grow his or her own capacities of assessing information of whatever kind, opinions, assertions, positions, by being capable of assessing the quality of the information and of calibrating his or her own trust in the information and taking a position. So if you are not capable of assessing the source of information, of asking questions about the expertise of the source of information or the benevolence of the source of information, also asking questions about the evidence that backs that kind of information, it becomes very difficult to take position in an informed and knowledgeable and rational way. So the idea was, and has always been and still is, children have the capacity and a predisposition for asking this kind of question. They are not gullible as we think they are. They start very early to think about, what am I going to believe? Is this source reliable or not? But growing up, we need knowledge to nourish this normal attitude of inquiry, knowledge that helps us to navigate in the middle of a complex panorama of sources of information, the internet, the media, my friends, what's happening in my context, and navigating complex contents of information. So the idea was that the school progressively, since kindergarten to university, of course, and even higher education, needs to provide these tools for tooling the mind with the capacity of properly assessing the quality of an assertion, distinguishing knowledge from what's an opinion or a belief, by understanding how knowledge is produced in history, in journalism, in science, etc. And so by providing ground for better decisions. So this was the origin. And as you see, it's strongly connected with teaching science, but also other disciplines in school. So we have enlarged our panorama, saying that teaching critical thinking is putting drops of critical thinking in each and every discipline, interrogating every discipline about the epistemology. How do you build good knowledge, solid knowledge in your discipline? And how do we make that children, adolescents, adults understand how this knowledge is produced, how biases are reduced thanks to the methods of each of these disciplines, and how a better quality knowledge is produced that I can trust because I know what's behind.
Thank you, Elena. Actually, I would like to emphasize and support very much what you said on the importance of critical thinking in science education, but also that it has to be part of all the different subjects. And this is really the approach that we have taken at the OECD on that. Jonathan, you are, science educator or researcher on science education, and you've actually written a few papers on the importance of critiquing in science education, and perhaps the fact that it was not developed enough in most of the pedagogies of science. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think let me build on what Elena was just saying. I think by and large I agree with her. I think the fundamental issue confronting people when confronted with science claims is one of whom to trust, because we don't have the expertise to evaluate the evidence ourselves. I mean, a classic example of this is that most of us probably believe in anthropogenic climate change, but I suspect most of us have not read the IPCC report. So it is very much an issue of what knowledge do you need to trust somebody. So I think that the really, in the case of science, which is obviously my area, I think much of the knowledge you need is actually not taught either in school science or really in undergraduate science, because you need to understand that the goal of science is consensus, that the production of reliable knowledge is produced by a whole set of social practices which peer review in the limited sense, but there's peer review in the broader sense within the community, where knowledge claims are judged, and one paper in isolation does not make for a reliable source in that way. You also need to have some kind of understanding of who is an expert. So somebody who's an expert in cosmology is not an expert in virology, just having the label scientist. And these are lots of issues so there is knowledge there that you need. But in addition to that, I think what you need is really an understanding of that process, which comes through looking at what you might call certain basic ideas in the context of science. So, for instance, most of us believe that day and night is caused by a spinning Earth. But, okay, how many of you can tell us any of the evidence? Okay. Most of us believe that diseases are spread by invisible organisms called germs. Okay, none of us ever seen a germ, so why do we believe in these in that kind of way? Most of us believe that matter is made of atoms. We have never seen atoms, really, so why do we believe them? So going through those kinds of exercises in the context of science, looking at what the evidence is that leads us to the belief, and seeing that science is basically an evidence-based set of beliefs is fundamental to developing what you might call the critical disposition that all scientists have, because all scientists basically look and say, what's the evidence in that sense? Now, as a lay member of the public, we cannot evaluate the evidence, but you need to be able to ask the scientist what the basis of their evidence is. So that, I think, is needed. And then you also need, I think, knowledge. There's no doubt about that. If you're going to make sense of any of the discourse that comes from scientists. So, for instance, when you go to a doctor, it does help if you know what parts of the body are in that kind of way in order to engage in a conversation. You don't need a lot of detail. I mean, I do not need to know exactly how the liver functions, but I do need to know what its function is in the body in that kind of way. So it's a mix of a broad base of knowledge, okay, and a disposition. And the function of science education is to cultivate that disposition by actually occasionally, rather than asserting or asking students to believe things because they're in the textbook, showing them and exploring the evidence and the arguments that have led to these beliefs.
So it sounds like a fine line or balance between actually believing, and perhaps because, most of the time we don't have time to do something different, and being able to, from time to time, challenge some of the things, or be able to actually ask about where all these different evidence is coming from.
Yes, I mean, particularly when you're confronted by claims that are beyond your area of expertise, which is what most of us are in that kind of way. So how do you start to get a sense of what the reliable knowledge is in this context? And in the work that we've been doing for the past couple of years, we really say there are three kinds of questions you need to ask, which is, first of all, is the claim coming from somebody who's got a conflict of interest? That's a big red flag. Second one, is the claim coming from somebody who has appropriate expertise in the area? Well, if they haven't got appropriate expertise in the area, that's another big red flag. And then the third one is, what is the scientific consensus on this? And if there is a well-established scientific consensus, anybody who's claiming that, well, Galileo was wrong, so I can be right, or Galileo was fighting against the consensus, so I'm like Galileo. Well, Galileo was the exception. This is a delusion that people operate on. So it is a balance, yes, but I think what's missing fundamentally, what a lot of my work has been about, is a recognition within the context and the way we teach science, which is to put an emphasis on saying, this is an evidence set of basis of beliefs. If I'm teaching you about, say, even something as simple as day and night, that's, for instance, is something they do in elementary schools, I can point you to some evidence about why I believe this, even though it's much more sensible. Observation tells you that the sun moves. And there are lots of examples of that. And that, I think, builds faith in the activity of science, its ability to produce reliable knowledge.
Okay, thank you. So let's move now to higher education, and Caroline, you've been actually leading an initiative, Creating KEDU, which was a big consortium of universities trying to advance critical thinking in higher education. Usually speaking, higher education is considered to be the place where you do a lot of critical thinking. So why did you feel like we needed more of that, and why is it important in the higher ed sector as well?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me in this conversation. And I just have this opportunity to greet everyone here online. It's a gift to have you all over the world. And I'm very pleased to share this panel with my distinguished colleagues. I send you some greetings from UTAD in Villarreal, which is the capital of the Douro region, where we do the Porto wine. That said, I'm going to answer to your question, and I think that talking about critical thinking being important in higher education is indeed a paradox, since critical thinking should be at the core of its mission. However, having so many institutions and colleagues around the world who have manifested their interests and their lack of confidence that this is really being implemented in higher education shows that it is of utmost importance and necessary. In my view, rather than focusing on the statements in the missions of our higher educations, we have to bring it alive in our routines, in institutional program and course routines. Of course, I must say that there is a shift, and of course the OCDE project has helped to have this shift. I am still very concerned because several studies and one very recent in May show that students do not come necessarily with more critical thinking than they leave higher education. This is really very concerning. And the results of our project, the European one, show also that for many disciplines, the critical thinking that is needed in the professions and as citizens, there is a big gap. We don't really deliver what is expected in our society in terms of critical thinking. This being said, aren't we nurturing critical thinking? I'm not going that far, of course, but it is far from being enough. And especially with the challenges that we have in the world right now, that my colleagues already talked about. And so I would like to point out maybe 4 reasons for why it's not, why it's still necessary and why it is not so nurtured at this moment. Several factors contribute to that. The first one is that teachers, at least in Portugal and in many other countries we found, have in general no professional development in teaching, and let alone in critical thinking teaching, which is a domain per se. They are driven to focus also more on publishing and investigation instead of having a more consistent teaching skills for critical thinking. That's the evaluation system that we have. In focus, in class, the focus is still put largely, unfortunately, on transmission of information and knowledge, and that's more recalling not higher order thinking skills. Of course, there are differences, and this is shifting. But one of the most important reasons that I would focus on is that although critical thinking dispositions, which my colleague talked about a little bit, Jonathan, are very, very important because they drive the cognitive functions of critical thinking. I'm thinking about truth truth-seeking, curiosity, self-confidence, systematicity. These dispositions are much harder to promote as teachers or in a classroom than the cognitive ones that we are more experienced in ASPAS. So the dispositions have to be tackled and in a very, very serious way. It's not easy. And then maybe also critical thinking needs time. And that's another reason why. And our programs are loaded with a lot of content. And we, instead of learning how to go through the content and process the content at higher levels of cognitive functions, we stuff a little bit the minds. And I think we need time and we need alignment between first year, second year, third year, so that there is a progressive development of critical thinking in a very systematic and explicit way, because that's what also literature has shown. We might be nurturing critical thinking, but not in a very explicit and systematic way along the whole curricula. So that's what I would say for now.
Thank you, Caroline. And I would really want to say that indeed one of the things that we've been trying to do in our work at the OECD was really to make critical thinking much more intentional, and explicit in what people have been trying to do. So it was already there, but of course, once you try to make it intentional, then that's when we believe, you can really have results.
Right.
So, Nico, can you tell us, you've also been part of the work, you've been working with colleagues on how to actually support critical thinking, and and we can see that sometimes it is difficult. It changes a few things, and so what actually do you feel it changes in, especially in terms of the relationship between the professor and the students, and also the relationship to knowledge when it happens?
Right. Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you all for inviting me to be here. It's so exciting to share my views and with others and discuss on critical thinking. As Jonathan and Elena mentioned, it's quite interesting to reflect on trust, belief, and reliability in knowledge and interaction. And in such a context like Japan or in Asian countries, sometimes we need to pay attention to learning environment where critical thinking can be really fostered and also expressed. Because when we have this hierarchical relation between professors or teachers and learners, then it's very difficult for us to create an open discussion and also opportunities for all to participate in creation of knowledge. So basically, when we talk about critical thinking, we oftentimes need to pay attention to transformation of attitude to begin with, to see where the learners are ready to really give critical thinking skills. And we find that critical thinking is not just a set of skills, but it requires attitudinal transformation and also constant encouragement for students to be able to practice and make it a habit. We also found in practicing critical thinking skills, it's quite difficult for students to just master critical thinking within the classroom, but we need to link it to the outside classroom, like extracurricular activities, social activities, or experiential learning like service learning, whereby students can really try and practice critical thinking rather than behaving well enough to be critical because teachers tell them to do so. And that critical thinking may not be useful in a society where they're at.
Thank you. So that reminds us that, indeed, and it is something that Caroline and that was said before, it is really important to cultivate it as a disposition and not just something that, should be ticked as part of the list of learning outcomes in some ways. We had a question by Osvaldo actually asking us to talk a bit more about evaluating IDs, because that's the topic that's the title of the webinar. And actually, that's really one of the important aspects of critical thinking. But also to get back and perhaps to close that part of our discussion, usually, there are two different elements to critical thinking. One is thinking, and weighing evidence, making sure that indeed, there is good reasoning and that you can, there is enough strength in what is being said. And there is a critical part of it. And what we found, and especially in our recent work, is that this is probably the part that people feel less comfortable with. And actually, it was interesting that, Elena mentioned how in France, the critics to science were actually one of the elements that led all this discussion about critical thinking. I think, Jonathan, you told us that, you want to be critical, but not too much. You have to because, it has to follow the kind of scientific consensus on things. But of course, science also evolved because some people are critical to science, and then they try to make things change and create new types of consensus as well, So there is this element of perspective taking, getting with new types of ideas, etc. So how do you see that second element, and how to navigate that criticality of critical thinking, in your opinion? And do you have the feeling that it is something which is a bit more difficult to do, or that perhaps it's not for education, but perhaps more for higher education? Or what are your views on that? Go ahead, Carol.
May I start? Okay. So in the notion of criticality that I am familiar with, based in the movement of researchers and practitioners and teachers like Barnett or Giroux or Brookfield, with a strong base on critical pedagogy and Paulo Freire also, the dimension of taking action or taking stance is enhanced. And along, of course, with thinking and being reflexive. The discomfort may arise from the view that critical thinking in the dimension of criticality encompasses a political dimension, the consciousness of and the reflection on power issues or oppressors, conflicts. And in my point of view, if criticality is not used as a dogma, which would be contrary to critical thinking, it is a perspective that can promote a healthy indignation towards unfair situations and trigger real action for change. So there is a quote that I don't know exactly who wrote it, but it comes from one of the authors of this movement, which says like this: criticality without critical thinking is empty. Critical thinking without action is myopic. That's what I would have to say around this.
Okay. Jonathan?
Well, I'll say two things. I mean, evaluating ideas, I think basically in science you're evaluating ideas all the time, because basically what you're doing is looking at theories and the evidence that supports them. So I see theories and ideas as equivalent in that sense. You're not evaluating ideas, though, if you're simply learning a body of factual information which you reproduce for exams. And I think the fundamental problem that's been pointed to by other people in their own disciplines is that you don't actually ask students to engage in critical action enough. What you need are questions which say, what is wrong with the following argument? What is the flaw in this calculation? Why is this set of data not to be trusted? Now, that's the kind of disposition that engenders critical thinking in that sense, or which is the best design for an experiment to investigate this. And those kinds of activities I don't see, and they're very rare. And when they do happen, I mean, in history, for instance, my own personal one was, you could have said, okay, why is the argument that the British won the Spanish Armada because they had superior fleet flawed in that sense? And these kinds of things suddenly open up to you the fact that actually these things are up for debate, that they require you to engage with them critically, and that there is an argument to be had from evidence. And I think it's about only if you engage in that activity do you start to build that kind of disposition towards looking at all ideas as, first of all, asking the question, is this to be believed, and why in terms of the evidence?
Elena, you wanted to add something?
It's just another aspect, I think, of critical thinking. Critical thinking is a term we didn't want to use. We've been criticized a lot in France for using critical thinking because esprit critique, especially in French, is confounded with this idea of criticizing everything, of a negative attitude and not a positive attitude of empowerment in order to be able to select the best ideas, the best information available in order to build your own decision. It's just to be free to criticize everything without having ground for criticizing. So this is one aspect. So we struggled to keep the critical thinking expression because we thought that it would create an international dialogue, which was important to confront ideas. So this is one point about criticality. And the other point is, in critical thinking, another thing I think it's very important, to train, to create habits, as it was said, in young children progressively, is to assess one's own ideas. So of course, I'm predisposed to assess the ideas of others, and there are lots of studies about children at 3 years old age who assess the ideas of others, because you don't want to be gullible. I mean, you don't want others to overcome you, and it is a whole bunch of studies in epistemic vigilance. So we are vigilant toward the others. So we are much less vigilant towards ourselves and our own ideas, which is very difficult. And it is normal not to be so vigilant because you don't want to wake up in the morning and start saying, am I right? Am I right doing this? Is it okay if I go through to work? My theory, is it worth working on it even harder today, etc. So the confirmation bias, as it is called, it's a normal part of our cognitive function. But this is something we got to be trained to ask ourselves, what's the ground for my ideas? Why do I believe this? Which are the reasons? And to compare with other reasons and to find whether evidence in support of my ideas is as good as evidence in support of the ideas of others. And I think this is an important aspect of critical thinking education. We should not forget since the very early years of our life.
Thank you, Elena. So I think that on the being, critical about one's own ideas, that actually so we have produced a series of rubrics with colleagues, and actually this is one of the dimensions. We have a reflecting dimension as part of that, and it's really also about that, being able to see what are the, the limitations of one's own, positions, etc. But I think there is another point which is very important in what, all of you said, that it is something which has to happen occasionally, so that I think I really take the point. And that's true with creativity too, you don't want to be creative all the time, that's, but you need to have the ability to actually put that in place. So the big question, and we've had a few in the chat, is actually, what does it look like, in education, in school, what kind of practices? I think that, Jonathan has already mentioned a few ideas. People ask about how this relates to experiential learning, for example. And there is then the question also of how it is integrated as part of the curricula within our member countries. I can already say that in almost all OECD countries, critical thinking is one of the explicit objectives of the official curriculum. Now the big question is how actually it is put into practice, because having good intentions is something, and knowing how to actually implement them is another question. So let's start with you again, Elena. You in fact, because one of the things that you've done in France was actually to produce some pedagogical guides for critical thinking. And so can you give us a few ideas on what it could look like actually?
Yes, we started with Pâte, so on the foundation I work for, providing some handbooks about how to put these drops of critical thinking in normal courses, focusing on one aspect, one criterion for the assessment of ideas or information, etc. Sometimes you can focus on the source and put your attention on assessing whether the source is an expert and what does it mean in this particular field to find experts. What are the characteristics, the indicators of experts in this domain? In other cases, you will focus your attention on the benevolence. How do I spot private interests? In other cases, you put all the attention, and this is especially what we do at Pâte, on how you build evidence. And you ask students to build evidence, to do experiments, observations, and to compare the different levels of reliability when using one or another kind of methods. But there's one thing I think it's very important. We've learned with time, with the Conseil Scientifique de l'Éducation Nationale, and in the report we've written, which is we should not think that critical thinking can be taught as a discipline. It is not the hour of critical thinking once per week or once per year, which is even worse. It's dropped in every course, so it's regular, it's systematic, and it is also explicitly assumed. And this makes a big difference. That is one objection we've always had is, okay, but I already do that. I already provide my students with the basic knowledge they will need in order to assess the plausibility of an assertion, which is very important for critical thinking. We defend the idea that knowledge, factual knowledge, is crucial. So what's the difference with what we're saying? Teachers were saying, we'll already do that. So there's nothing we can add in order to really teach critical thinking or educate for critical thinking. And for us, one of the basic, let's say, strategies to implement it is the regularity, is the multiplication in the different courses, is the continuity, but also being explicit. Explicit with oneself. When I am teaching about assessing the evidence in support of a certain idea, I have to know that this is part of teaching critical thinking, and I have to express this to the students. We are now working on an experiment in chemistry, and you have the impression that we're learning something about chemistry, but it's not just that. We're also learning how to build evidence and how to assess whether the evidence is solid or not. So in your daily life, you have to think in the same way. And this must be explicit. You have to train students to translate what they're doing in the classroom with simple examples for daily life where they can reuse exactly that kind of tool, of thinking tool. So explicit critical thinking for us is really key in order to change education, which doesn't mean adding 1 hour of critical thinking, but it means really transforming the way you teach the disciplines. So adding much more methodology, but adding also much more explicit translation from the classroom to how I use this in order to assess new ideas. So this is one point. And the second point I want to be short is training teachers. So if we want to transform the system, providing resources for the classroom is not enough. Teachers are examples of using critical thinking. They have to model critical thinking in their classroom. It is not enough to say, hey, you have to think critically, and then not implement it in the way you teach. So we are trying to we're doing lots of efforts in order to train teachers. We had training for teachers trainers, and we created tools for teachers trainers in order to train teachers with these principles. And I think this is really key in order to transform the educational system. And I don't think I have to convince you, Stefan, that the third big structural element is evaluation. What's not evaluated is not taught. And if we want critical thinking to transform the way we teach, we also have to have tools for assessing what happens when we teach in a different way. And if we obtain this objective of developing progressively and tooling the critical thinking mental box, cognitive box of our pupils.
Thank you, Elena. We do actually indeed believe that assessment and evaluation is important, and also teacher training and providing resources to people, and that's really what very much we're trying to do. But it makes also a nice transition to ask Jonathan about it, and especially that Jonathan is the chair of one of the PISA science group, and which actually at the highest level probably tries also to assess the critical thinking of the 15-year-old students. So, Jonathan, what are the kind of examples of practices that you could quote, and how do you relate it to the changes in terms of assessment?
Right. Well, just to build on some of the things that I said before, I mean, I think critical thinking is something that has to occur in all disciplines. There's a danger in this, which is critical thinking is a bit like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody thinks it's a good thing, and everybody thinks it's somebody else's responsibility. So the first thing is every discipline has to accept the responsibility for it. I mean, yes, we want everybody to be critical thinkers, but the next question is to ask, well, actually, what does it mean to be a critical thinker in your discipline? And I think this is where you come back to the PISA bit, because you've actually got to be able to say, what would you expect the average 15-year-old or the average 18-year-old or the average undergraduate, okay, to be able to do at the end, which would be an example of critical thinking? And I think to ask that question is the fundamental starting question, because you're asking what competency, what are the outcomes? Okay, and that I think is a challenge to anybody who says, oh yes, we teach critical thinking. My question is, well, what can they do that you've taught them and enabled them to do? And that often stops people in their tracks, I think, to start off with. So then you come to obviously things like, what are we trying to do in PISA in a way to encourage this? Well, in the 2025, which is the focus on science, we merged two of the old competencies, and we've introduced this third competency, which is to research, evaluate, and obtain information for decision-making and action. And this one is really very much focusing on how do you make judgments about some of the claims that people are making. So, for instance, if you have a claim saying that actually masks are useless against preventing infection because the coronavirus is smaller than the holes in the mask, why is it that people believe in masks, and how would you obtain that information? Now, nothing you taught in school science could enable you to evaluate that, because we don't address that. So what kinds of competencies are needed? You need to see who's making that statement, what their expertise is. This goes back to some of the earlier things that we were saying, because actually the physics behind it is quite complicated. The reason the masks are effective is because of Brownian motion. So, but if you looked at the paper, you would know that. So I think what we're trying to say is these kinds of exercises where students are asked to evaluate information have to be something which is embedded in the curriculum, the drip approach. It has to start early. Okay, this is what the Finns have been doing. Okay, and I think the more enlightened countries are saying, where do we start in elementary school? What kinds of competencies are we believing in? What kinds of outcomes do we want at the end? Because this has been the failure of all science curricula that ostensibly have the aim of making their students scientifically literate. But in the end, actually what they do most of the time is teach all the material that are needed to be a professional scientist. They never state in their questions what they think students could or should be able to do by the age of 15 that would demonstrate the conception of scientific literacy. So I think that takes you on to the evaluation, which is you have to come back to this framework of asking, what's the competency? How would we measure that competency?
Thank you. We have a question by Pâte, saying that especially in developing countries, the hierarchical nature of societies and institutions make it challenging for students. So linking to what you said, Mikiko, so I'd like to ask you the question. So in this type of context, what are the types of practices that can actually still be implemented?
Okay, thank you very much. In the developing countries as well as in Japan, I would suppose, there's a lot of hierarchy in the classroom situation whereby students are very not encouraged to ask questions, first of all, or even challenge teachers or textbooks. So in that case, how can we nurture critical thinking skills, right? And we found experiential learning quite interesting and stimulating, because when it comes to academic learning, students always think about, okay, answers have to be written in the textbook, or the teachers are the ones who give you an answer. So we kind of, students have very passive attitude. But when it comes to experiential learning, we say the answer is in your action. Answer is in your communication with society. So go and explore your answer. And then students realize, okay, my knowledge and experience can be equally treated as independent ideas and experiences. So that kind of preconception can break through somehow, even at the higher education level, but maybe earlier the better. So this, and I have listened to others' discussion, and I feel like, probably in the Western society, you kind of assume that ideas can exist independently from relations. But in many societies, like in Asia, ideas are all relational, trust also. So it's quite difficult to challenge somebody without thinking that this person's position to me. So I think, again, it's we need to think about transformation of attitude, and also how we can really break through this pre-existing hierarchical relationship in learning environment, and also even the process of creating the knowledge together with the learners.
So, Mikiko, do you think that, part of it is the answer lies in what Jonas and Elena said, that it has to start early, from really in the early ages in primary school, or what? Otherwise, how do we break that? And especially given that schools and higher education institutions are indeed part of a society, and so they also reflect part of this society, and it will remain the case for the foreseeable.
Yeah, that's a good question, because Japan is famous for having very nice, lively classroom environment at the early stage, like primary. And then as you go up and up, students become passive. So it could, it's better to start early, but it's not enough probably. At higher education, we focus on expertise in more specialized areas. That's where we build hierarchical relation between the expertise and students. So perhaps, as Caroline mentioned, we need some training for higher education professors and lecturers to really be exposed to different knowledge, in which liberal arts education could work very nicely, to really break through all these disciplinary boundaries, and for lecturers and teachers to have more open-minded kind of attitude towards unknown knowledge and situation, and to explore new knowledge with the students.
In the case of Japan, actually, and the process you have described reminds us that, there is a very important university entrance exam. And so perhaps this actually loops back to, how this is shaped, what are the expectations, and, how this actually shapes the experience of teaching and learning as you get older, and Japan is just one example of countries where this is the case, basically. But, and so here we're talking again about the articulation alignment between what is expected for, I would say, important transitions for people, the high stakes, and as social institutions, and in fact the reality of what is visible in that context. Caroline, perhaps you can also tell us a little bit about, what these practices, in your opinion, can look like in practice, in higher ed. So what are the types of pedagogies? So here we have a consensus that it has to be done not in as a specific subject, but more across the board. So what are an example you could give us, for example?
Yes, well, first of all, I just want to tell my colleagues that I completely agree, and their ideas are very fundamental. Modeling, and it's absolutely essential, and questioning. Starting with a question at the beginning of the semester that you have to, at the end, you have to have it answered, or at least 190% answered. And along the semester, having sub-questions coming up and having to solve them, it's one of the best ways, good question, Socrates and the Agora. But in my view, what is really very important for things to change is really focusing on teachers, on professional teaching. And we have been working a lot on that in an ongoing basis. And it starts just with, for example, like Jonathan said, what are the objectives that we want from students at the end of the semesters? I will give you an example in education science. One question can be, what are the different theoretical perspectives on education? Okay. Another one that would be a more critical thinking one would be, what is this practice that we are seeing in a future teacher or in a teacher? To which theoretical framework is it related? How can you induce a practice from a theory or the contrary? So that will make students look for other things than just knowing what the theories are and just peel out the information. That's an example. But I think service teaching, service learning is absolutely important. And I would say that we have to put in the center cooperative learning and not individual learning. Cooperative at the core of what we are. Not only because AI is there and students, if they work in an individual basis to interact with machine, it might, in fact, grow the inequalities between students, because the student who already has a background to question things and argue and be able to look for more information, maybe he or she have a different way of working with machine. Other students who come with not this background, they will become, in my view, more and more dependent on the machine. So the cooperative groups in the interaction with the AI may a little bit, if it is to be used, because I'm not convinced, it has to be in my point of view, it has a lot of value if we do it with cooperative learning.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so actually I think that you've raised a question that everyone is waiting for, has been waiting for the whole webinar. We haven't spoken yet about ChatGPT and generative AI. So what do you think it is going to change? Is it an opportunity or challenge to critical thinking and its teaching and learning in schools?
Well, I do think there is a significant problem with AI in the sense that you cannot easily see what the sources are for its claims. Mm-hmm. And that's problematic, because one of the things I think we're all advocating for is one of trust, and you need to know the sources and you need to be able to make a judgment for it. You can, if you ask it, I'm sure we've all tried it out, what are your sources for this? You do get some sources. So that's a problem. Okay, the positive side about it is it's a large language model, so that basically what it finds is the either the consensus view, or it shows that, well, on the one hand there's this, on the other hand there's that. So it puts the two competing arguments out there in that kind of way. So if you wanted to take the glass half full, you would say that AI was an improvement. If you wanted to take the glass half empty, you'd say it's dangerous because we don't know where its claims are coming from and we don't know how it's being manipulated. I'm afraid my view at the moment is we'll have to wait and see, but undoubtedly students are going to use it a lot. And the question is, how are you going to teach them to question the information it produces?
Thank you. Who wants to add? Mikiko or Caroline too? Okay.
Can I
Mikiko
say something?
Caroline.
Okay, from the other end, of the spectrum to look at the AI generated all this sort of information. Probably in countries where there's hierarchical relationship between teachers and the students, or expertise and non-expertise, it may be useful to have this kind of anonymous information based on which we could develop some critical thinking or review and reflect on what's there and what your independent thinking. That's a kind of a possibility for me to think about the critical thinking skills through AI.
Thank you.
I would just add, if it's possible, I don't know if Elena wants to say something, but I would like to say that in my view, AI, if it's used to retrieve information, which is much faster than at all times right now, and eventually more complete, but Jonathan has his, and I agree with him, we have to be careful with that. I think if it's going to substitute responses regarding analysis, evaluation, creation, I think that's substituting the critical thinking of a human mind. So I wouldn't use it so early in time, because otherwise we're going to have empty we have empty minds with these tools, with these critical thinking tools of questioning, of analyzing, of evaluating ideas. So yes, for information, but with cautious and maybe not with higher order thinking skills at the moment, and in a very reserved way, so that we can develop these skills before they take care of us. And metacognition is here very important also. We need to learn how to learn, as the machines do. Right now, they are learning with errors. And we need, as humans, to know to accept the errors and trust also our minds. The question of trust is also how we trust ourselves through thorough reflections. But metacognition, I think, is going to be the most important skill at the moment, to learn how to learn, and strategies, which strategies are the best to learn.
Thank you. So I think, I don't know, Elena, if you want to add something.
Very shortly, because they work with the younger children, which are not yet touched by AI in the same way. But I think that's the idea of having kids learning how to plan their own experiments, ask their own questions, is something that will remain important in this area where you can find answers written somewhere. It was true of Wikipedia too. This is not really new for younger students. If you only teach contents, they will try to produce content in a very quick and inexpensive, cognitively inexpensive way. But there are some things that it cannot do that way. And it is imagining an experiment, conducting an experiment, making mistakes, assessing their own mistakes, comparing their own mistakes with the mistakes of their colleagues. And that's why you were talking, I think, also collaborative learning in this sense. And this is a training that you can have, and it is a real metacognitive training, meaning I reflect on why I made the choices, where do they lead me, and what can I do with them. And I think that for grown-ups, we will have to have much more reflection on how we think, starting to do much more cognitive science, probably, in education. How we think and how it is different from how an artificial intelligence thinks. And this will be a great opportunity for metacognition, having students assessing the differences between human mind and artificial minds as they are today, what is copied, what is different. And it will be a huge development in the way we understand ourselves, if we want to see the glass at least half full.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to all of you. We're reaching the end of our webinar. And actually, our critical thinking has led to kind of a consensual position that critical thinking needs to be nurtured in all the subjects in education, at all levels of education, that it requires time, and this is something that, you know, we have to take into account, but also professional development for teachers, and a change in the relationship between students and professors, which can actually happen by applying it and using practice-based pedagogies where people have a chance actually to assess arguments, the flows of some theories, and also just try to act based on what they are doing. We have actually developed at the OECD a lot of different resources giving examples of what this can look like. We have rubrics showing what the sub-dimensions of or sub-skills of critical thinking look like in different disciplines, and also have a few examples of lesson plans which you can find on our website. So thank you so much for joining us today, Caroline, Jonathan, Mikiko, and Elena. And thank you for attending the meeting, and we'll have more webinars soon, and we hope to see you at those as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.